Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Cobin Soelberg. He's an anesthesiologist and a financial planner. Today's KevinMD article is titled, There Are So Many Paths to Financial Freedom. Cobin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
All right. So you have a dual role of an anesthesiologist and financial planner. So how did that come to be?
Yeah, thank you. So, my path's a little bit different in that, this all started years ago when I took a 3-year leave of absence during medical school, and I went and got a law degree out at University of Pennsylvania. And so, a lot of the wheels started turning at that time, and came back, finished medical school, then went to anesthesia training back in Philadelphia, and then took an academic position. And, as anyone in academics knows, like, you always have these teaching points that you do with residents. And really quickly, I found the questions they were asking weren't necessarily anesthesia related, but they were finance related. Like, how do I pay off my student loans? Or like, how can I ever possibly save for a house? And so I started teaching that stuff to residents, which eventually led to opening my own practice.
So we talk a lot about financial literacy on this podcast and the fact that that literacy is relatively low, I feel, in the physician community. So what's your thoughts on that?
I would absolutely agree. And, what's been bouncing around my head a lot lately is, in order to take risks, so whether it's, something like you've done and being very entrepreneurial, or taking a new position, or moving from academics to private practice, one of the most important things to do is protect your risk, right? And so, whether it's not having any disability insurance or being deeply in debt, I find that physicians don't even understand their cash flow. So they don't know what's coming in and they don't know what's going out. And they can't possibly pay off debt, much less invest or try and get ahead. And so, just in my home state, right? So I'm an anesthesiologist. The things that have been happening in the anesthesia marketplace in Oregon are crazy. Like, two of the big groups have lost big contracts within the state. There's outside groups coming in. The hospitals are trying to employ the physician. It's just crazy. And if you don't protect against that, like, it's just a huge hit to your finances.
So there's been a lot of attention on that physician finance space, right? Of course, there's passive income MD, there's white coat
Yep.
investor, lots of those resources. Now, just specifically over the last few years or so, have you seen the needle move when it comes to an improvement in physician financial literacy, or is it still pretty dismal?
There's not a lot of studies out there. The ones that I've seen are a couple of years old, but like, anecdotally, what I would tell you is I think there's a lot more engagement in this space. And so I certainly saw that when I was in an academic position, and even now in private practice, people want to know more about the business of medicine. So I do find that residents are more engaged and are wanting to learn about this topic. Just this past week, I was doing a lecture for the anesthesia residents up at OHSU, where I used to work. And there was a lot of great questions and engagement. And I find, especially now, what's interesting, right? Like, student loans have been at 0% for the last 3 years or so.
Yeah.
That stopped. And so a lot of people are like, holy moly, like, I actually need to figure this stuff out, if not for anything else, just for their own sort of self-survival, right? So I do think it's improving, thanks to people like you or White Coat Investor. Like, people are at least understanding the basics and figuring out good questions to ask. And many are doing it themselves or finding someone who's qualified to help them. And I think those are all positive signs for sure.
So anecdotally, I noticed that a lot of the major physician finance platforms are run by anesthesiologists like
Yeah.
yourself. Now, is there something about anesthesiology or the people that go into anesthesiology that selects them to also pursue business interests, entrepreneurial interests, and go into that physician finance space?
Yeah, it's a really interesting observation you have there, Kevin, because I think it's two fields actually. I think it's emergency medicine and anesthesia that you really see in those spaces. And I wonder if, you know, part of the reason maybe is that we don't have a patient population that we have to sort of keep on top of, right? Like, we show up to work, we do our job, and then we get to go home. And so I think we have the ability to create off time in a way that a lot of physicians or surgeons don't have. I think that might be some of it. I don't know that it's the business part of it because, surgeons are running private practices, internists are doing those same things. I really think it's just we have the ability to carve out time for those sorts of things in ways that others don't. But it's sort of interesting. There's Jimmy Turner, the physician philosopher.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people in anesthesia, which is for me, it's really fun because I've had people I can lean on
Sure.
and ask questions and get help with. So,
All right. So let's talk about your KevinMD article. It's titled "There Are So Many Paths to Financial Freedom." So how did your article come together?
well, I think, within the space in the last couple of years, I think probably the most popular thing has been passive investing through real estate.
Sure.
And, part of the concern I have, as an anesthesiologist, but also as a financial planner is the tone of a lot of these pieces are like, this is the only way that you can ever possibly get ahead. Like investing in the stock market is dumb, trying to be entrepreneurial, that's super risky. Real estate is the only way to go. And so, you know, part of what my goal was to let people know, like there's lots of things you can do. There's very simple things you can do, right? Like just maxing out your 401k at work and putting a little money aside in a brokerage account. That's going to get you there. But if you have interest in something like what you're doing and being entrepreneurial, and I know there's a lot of physicians out there who have ideas, whether it's for a surgical product or, like a business to business thing that would help their practice run better. They have these ideas that are fantastic ideas, but I think in general, physicians are a little risk averse. I think that's, partly because of what we do in our day jobs.
Sure.
Like we can't get things wrong, right? Like if you screw up at work, somebody gets hurt. So part of what I wanted to say is there's lots of things that you can do from the very, very basic to encouraging people to think about starting their own business. Cause I would ask you, like, I'm guessing you put a lot of time and effort into running this enterprise, right? But it seems like it's pretty fulfilling to you and you get to interact with a lot of different people and get to engage your curiosity.
Absolutely. And I think that leads to the next question I have. So the name passive income, implies that there's there's little to no work that goes into creating that alternative income stream. And you asked me in terms of how much time and effort I spend. It's pretty much more than I do as an internal medicine primary care physician. So talk about what I think is a misnomer in terms of passive income and realistically, how much work needs to go in order for it to become a viable income stream.
Yeah, I think a lot of physicians get sucked into that because they're like, that sounds great. Like, I'll just put some money in and then put my feet up, and it's just not a big deal. I mean, I can tell you with my own business, like, there is so much that goes into being a financial planner behind the scenes in order to have a 1 hour meeting with a client, right? Like, there's so much data to gather. There's so much information. Like, I'm constantly staying up on tax code and anything else that's going on, much less all the other things just to keep a business running. And I would say the same thing's true in real estate. In order to get a viable business up and running, you need to be able to figure out how to get those deals done. You need to figure out a really great real estate lawyer or real estate accountant. There's like all this background stuff. And then you constantly need to be in that loop where you're looking at deals. And then there's the whole other thing of like managing your properties. And so there's certainly a tremendous amount of work that goes into it up front. You can start offloading it and getting a little more efficient, but it's somewhere in the hour of like 20 to 1, like where it's a considerable amount. And I think a lot of people get in that space and realize it's way more work and they really are not that interested in it. And that's the thing, is that's fine. Like, I don't think you would be doing what you're doing if it didn't really engage you, right, and fulfill a need, because it's a lot of work.
So, where do physicians start? So, you mentioned there are a lot of physicians who may not be in our physician finance space or the side gig space,
Right.
and they're listening to you now and they're thinking, I want to start with an alternative income stream. But like you said, there are so many options available out there. So, tell us the first step. What kind of questions should they be asking themselves? Where should they look?
Thank you. I love that question. And, I was having a discussion. I was checking in with an old friend from med school who is a urologist. And, we hadn't talked in a while. And, I just said, how are things going? He said, I would love to be done like tomorrow, but I just don't know what to do with my time. And I feel like there's nothing else I can do. And so I gave him a little bit of homework. And, I said, for the next month or so, pay attention to a couple things, just two things. And they might be related, they might not. But for the next month, look at the kinds of activities that you're engaged in where you feel in the state of flow, or like time just flies. And that could be time with your kids, like, coaching a soccer game. That could be time out with your spouse. It could be, a particular kind of surgery that you do, like whatever it is, just pay attention to those things. So that was number one. The second part of it was like, pay attention to the activities that give you more energy. And at the time, I had just gotten back from a mountain bike ride. So of course I was a little bit tired, but I felt great, right? Like, it's something, being outside in nature and mountains for me is one of the things that really is fundamental to who I am. And so that's non-negotiable. But there's tons of things, whether it's sitting in a meeting, whether it's a particular kind of surgery, that are energy draining. So I asked him to do those two things, right? Pay attention to what's giving you energy and taking energy away, and when you feel really engaged in the work. And I think once you start noticing those things, you can start figuring out patterns of things that you're interested in, you enjoy doing, and give you energy. And I think if you're working on those types of things, you'll be naturally curious. So you'll be able to spend a lot of time that it takes, like we talked about just a minute ago. And it's fun. Like, your life can be fun again. It's not just this, like getting through this to-do list that's energy draining. Like, that sounds miserable. Who wants to live that way?
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned earlier was that physicians in general are a risk averse bunch. And as an alternative income stream grows, inevitably that's going to impinge on their professional time. And sometimes they
Sure.
may be faced into the decision of whether to cut back hours to engage in that alternative income stream. How can physicians get over that mentality of being risk adverse and perhaps taking those risks and chances to cut back on their hours and nurture some of these alternative streams?
I think as physicians, we're all naturally curious. I don't think we would be where we are if we weren't. But I think as your practice grows, as your income grows, you do get a little more risk averse. So I think part of it is just a mindset shift. And, a lot of what we do in the business space is you're just doing these little micro adventures, basically, right? Like, you're like, does this work or does this not work? And,
Yeah.
you know, you never want to do anything like, as Warren Buffett says, right? Like, you have to keep playing the game. In order to win, you have to keep playing, right? So you're not taking these risks that are going to completely ruin you. And I think, as a physician with a very stable day job, so, quote unquote, there's tons of ways that you can protect against that risk, right? Like having some cash set aside, making sure you have disability and life insurance. Like, once you have all those things, all these other risks, they're not as big and scary as we think they are. And so the thing that I've learned, so what I'll tell you, Kevin, I worked with a great physician coach, Dr. Dina George, a couple of years ago when I was starting out my business, and she really helped with a lot of this mindset stuff. And one of the key lessons I learned is just take the next step. It doesn't matter if that step is 1 inch or a foot or 10 feet. Take the next step, because often you don't know, like, you don't know where you're going to end up, but you know the direction you want to head. And I do think a lot of us in medicine get paralyzed by this fear that we have to be perfect. And I'm here to tell you, I make mistakes all the time. They're little mistakes and I learn from them, and then we do something different. And they're not catastrophic like they think we will be, but it's kind of like being in the gym. It's a skill and a muscle that you're building, and to start small.
So whenever I talk about this issue, the physician's finance space, side gigs, alternative income streams, in our world, this is relatively commonplace. It's kind of normalized in our world, in our Facebook
Yeah,
groups and
sure.
the doctors that we talk to. But it's a relative minority, right? When you step outside
Y-
of the silo, right? And there's still
Yeah,
some pushback, and there's still a mentality thinking that if physicians don't see patients 100% of the time, they're like less of a doctor, right? So,
yeah.
how do you push back against that mentality, that perception that if you're dipping your toes into something outside of medicine, you're not as good a doctor as someone who's there 24/7, and that antiquated mentality. So how do you reconcile
Yeah.
that tension?
It's, thankfully, I think that perception is diminishing over time. And, the thing that I talk with my own financial planning clients about is when you're doing the things in your life that are engaging and important to you. So, like if you're spending time with your kids, if you're spending time outside, if you're building a business, like things that really engage you, it actually, like, it makes you a better person, but I believe it also makes you a better physician, right? Like, you being so single-minded that you only do one thing, it leads to burnout. Like we see that left and right. I mean, it's I thought things were getting better towards the end of the pandemic, but I think they're worse than ever. And I think, and part of that is because we're not taking care of ourselves. We're not taking care of our health. We're not taking care of our relationships, and we're not staying curious. And so I think, the pushback that I would give is taking care of yourself always makes you a better physician. And that can take on a lot of different forms. And I think, part of what I found doing medicine and law, for example, is it like approach the practice of medicine differently. And I get to use those skills in different areas, helping my group run as treasurer and other things that I love. And it keeps me engaged. I don't think it makes me a less engaged or a worse physician at all.
We're talking to Cobin Soelberg. He's an anesthesiologist and financial planner. Today's KevinMD article is titled, "There Are So Many Paths to Financial Freedom." Cobin, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
I think the biggest is like start small and just, jump into a few of these things, and none of this will be a catastrophic, right? The other is, I think in order to start jumping into this space, whatever it is that you're interested in doing, protect your downside risk first. That's very easy to take care of through putting a little money aside, insurance and other things. And then you can afford to take these risks knowing they won't be catastrophic.
Cobin, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, time, and insight. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Kevin.